I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change.
Something dramatic is happening inside Buckingham Palace. King Charles is stepping aside to focus on Queen Elizabeth II's historic centenary celebration. William is taking charge, and Harry and Meghan have been shut out completely from the Balmoral. But what secrets are hiding behind the palace gates? And is this the end of Harry and Meghan's royal story for good? Join us as we reveal everything. The silent power transfer. Something big was happening inside Buckingham Palace, and most people had no idea, because from the outside everything looked the same. The guards were at their posts, the flags were flying, and King Charles was still showing up to public events and waving to the crowds. But behind those famous walls, something had quietly and permanently changed. King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer, and although the palace said very little about how serious it was, the people closest to him knew the truth. He no longer had the energy to give his full attention to every problem facing the royal family, and the situation with Harry and Meghan had become a very big problem indeed. On top of his health battles, Charles had something else consuming his time and attention. He was deeply involved in planning the centenary celebration of Queen Elizabeth II's birth, a landmark national moment that he felt a personal and profound responsibility to get right, because this was not just a public event. It was a tribute to his mother, the woman who had devoted her entire life to the crown, and Charles wanted every detail to reflect the scale of her legacy. With so much on his plate, Charles made a decision that would turn out to be one of the most important of his reign. He stepped back from the Sussex conflict and handed control of the matter to two people he trusted completely: his son, Prince William, and his sister, Princess Anne, two royals who had always put duty first, and who had watched Harry and Meghan's behavior with growing anger and disbelief. This was not a small or temporary move. This was a real transfer of power, and it meant that the man now in charge of handling the monarchy's most damaging family crisis was William, not Charles. And William had a very different way of doing things. He was harder, he was colder, and he had already made up his mind about what needed to be done. The question now was just how far he was willing to go. The rise of the Iron Triad. With King Charles stepping back, the monarchy needed strong hands to take the wheel. And those hands belonged to three people who had spent their entire lives putting the crown before everything else: Prince William, Princess Anne, and Prince Edward, three royals who thought the same way, believed the same things, and were now completely united around one shared mission: protecting the monarchy from what they saw as a direct threat from within. Princess Anne was the oldest of the three, and in many ways the most respected working royal in Britain. She had never chased headlines, never complained, never looked for shortcuts, and she had made it very clear over the years that she had no patience for royals who treated their titles as a tool for personal gain. She believed that wearing a royal title came with one condition, and one condition only: you served the public, full stop. Prince Edward had walked a similar path. He had faced his own difficulties earlier in his life, and had learned the hard way that the palace expected loyalty and discipline above all else. And by this point in his life, he had become exactly the kind of steady and reliable figure that William needed beside him, someone who understood the rules and believed in them completely. But it was William who was now leading this group, and the people around him could see that something had shifted in him. He was no longer the cautious prince who carefully chose his words and avoided confrontation. He had watched his brother walk away from the royal family, sell their private stories to the world, and then continue to use royal titles and connections to build a commercial brand. And something in William had hardened because of it. The three of them came together around a very simple but very firm belief that a royal title was not something you could keep in your back pocket and pull out whenever it was useful to you. It was not a brand. It was not a business asset. It was a lifetime commitment to public service. And if you were not willing to honor that commitment, then you had no right to the title at all. The half-in, half-out model that Harry had once proposed, the idea that he could be both a working royal and a private individual at the same time, was now completely and officially dead. William and his allies had buried it, and they had no intention of ever digging it back up. William's doctrine: no mercy. William did not see what was happening with Harry and Meghan as a simple family disagreement or a misunderstanding that could be fixed with a quiet conversation over dinner. He saw it as something far more serious. He saw it as a form of fraud, a deliberate and ongoing attempt to exploit the crown for personal and financial gain, and he was determined to put a stop to it. The issue that troubled William most was not the interviews or the Netflix documentaries or even the book, as damaging as all of those things were. What truly angered him was the way Harry and Meghan were using their royal titles while simultaneously claiming to have left the royal family behind. They had stepped back from royal duties. They had moved to America. They had built a commercial empire, and yet the titles Prince Harry and Princess Meghan were still being used everywhere, on websites, in press releases, in business dealings, and in the minds of the public who associated those names with the British crown. To William, this was deeply wrong because every time those titles appeared on a product or a deal or a public appearance, it meant the monarchy's name and reputation were being used to make money that the monarchy had no control over and had never agreed to, and that was something he simply could not accept. The situation became even more complicated when Harry and Meghan began referencing their children's titles in public. Archie and Lilibet had been granted the titles of Prince and Princess following the death of Queen Elizabeth, and William felt strongly that using those children's titles in a commercial context was a line that should never have been crossed, because those children were too young to consent and too innocent to be used as leverage in what had become a very adult and very calculated power game. William drew a line, and he made sure the people around him understood exactly where that line was. You were either a working member of the royal family who lived by its rules and served the public, or you were a private citizen who gave up the titles and the privileges and got on with your life. But you could not be both. There was no in-between. There was no arrangement that allowed you to profit from the crown while pretending to have walked away from it. And from this point forward, William was going to make sure of that. The Australia intervention. While William was building his strategy behind palace walls, Harry and Meghan were making plans of their own. And one of those plans involved Australia, a country with deep ties to the British monarchy, a place where the royal family had always been welcomed warmly, and a destination that the Sussexes saw as friendly territory where they could travel, connect with the public, and remind the world of their relevance and star power. But William had anticipated this move, and he acted before Harry and Meghan ever stepped off the plane, reaching out directly to Commonwealth officials and key figures within the Australian government, with a message that was polite in its delivery, but crystal clear in its meaning. Harry and Meghan were private citizens. They did not represent the crown, they did not speak for the royal family, and they should not be treated as though they did. This was a bold and deliberate move, because it was one thing to manage the Sussex situation privately within palace walls, but it was something else entirely to reach out to foreign governments and make sure they understood the official position before any visit even began. It showed that William was not simply reacting to things as they happened, he was thinking several steps ahead, and he was willing to take the fight beyond British borders to protect the monarchy's global reputation. The message William was sending to Australia and to the wider Commonwealth was simple but powerful. The Sussex brand and the British crown were two completely separate things, and any government or institution that gave Harry and Meghan the kind of official welcome normally reserved for working royals was doing so without the palace's blessing and against the palace's wishes. For Harry and Meghan, this intervention was a significant blow because so much of their public appeal rested on the perception that they were still connected to the royal family in some meaningful way, that when people came to see them, or buy tickets to their events, or sign deals with their foundation, they were engaging with something that carried the weight and history of the British monarchy behind it. And William was working very hard to make sure that perception was dismantled, quietly but thoroughly, one conversation at a time, on every continent where the crown still mattered. The children's titles, the ultimate pressure point. Of all the weapons available to William in his efforts to draw a firm and permanent line between the crown and the Sussexes, one stood above all the others in terms of its potential impact, and that was the question of Archie and Lilibet's titles, because nothing in this entire conflict carried more emotional weight or more practical consequence than the idea that two young children could one day lose the royal status they had been given at birth. When Queen Elizabeth passed away, the rules around royal titles changed automatically, and under the terms of a long-standing royal decree, Harry's children became entitled to be called Prince and Princess, a significant upgrade from the courtesy titles they had held before, and one that Harry and Meghan had not been slow to use in public, on their website, in press materials, and in various commercial contexts that William found deeply troubling. William had been watching this closely, and he had drawn a direct comparison with what had happened to Prince Andrew, his uncle, who had seen his own daughters lose their working royal status following his spectacular fall from grace. And William understood that there was a legal mechanism available to the crown that could, if the decision was ever made, remove or restrict the titles held by Harry's children, a mechanism known as letters patent, a formal royal instrument that could redefine who was and was not entitled to royal status. William had not made that decision yet, and it was not one he took lightly, because at the center of this particular pressure point were two small children who had done nothing wrong and who deserved to be protected from the consequences of decisions made by the adults around them. The message being sent through back channels and through the palace's increasingly firm public positioning was clear. If Harry and Meghan continued to leak stories to the media, continued to exploit the children's titles for calm eye-martial purposes, and continued to position themselves as semi-royal figures on the global stage, then the nuclear option was on the table. It was a pressure point unlike any other in this conflict. Because it was personal, it was irreversible, and it struck at the very heart of what Harry and Meghan had built their brand around. The idea that their family carried the blood, the history, and the prestige of the British royal family. And William was making it very clear that prestige could be taken away. The passport and identity war. While the battle over titles played out in the background, another quieter but equally significant struggle was taking shape. One that centered not on public statements or media leaks, but on something far more practical and far more symbolic. The question of what documents Harry and Meghan were entitled to carry, what identity the British state was prepared to recognize for them, and whether the Sussex brand they had built so carefully had any official standing at all. The issue of diplomatic passports had been raised in various discussions around Harry's status, because diplomatic passports were not simply travel documents. They were a statement of who you were and what you represented. They offered legal protections and privileges in foreign countries that ordinary passports did not, and they were issued to people who were acting in an official capacity on behalf of the British state, which Harry, as a private citizen living in California, quite simply was not. The palace made its position clear. Harry was not entitled to a diplomatic passport, he was not a working royal, he was not carrying out official duties on behalf of the crown, and treating him as though he were would send entirely the wrong message to the world about what it meant to hold a royal title and what responsibilities came attached to it. But the passport question was really just one part of a much larger identity battle that was quietly being waged. Because the Sussex brand itself, the name, the imagery, the carefully constructed public identity that Harry and Meghan had built since leaving royal life, rested on a foundation that the palace did not recognize and was actively working to undermine. The idea that you could brand yourself as Sussex, trade on the associations that name carried with the British royal family, and do so without the agreement or oversight of the institution that name was borrowed from. William's position on this was straightforward and uncompromising. A title used publicly to open doors, attract investment, sell tickets, and build a media profile was not a private matter. It was a direct use of the crown's name and reputation for personal gain, and the crown had every right to say no, to withhold recognition, to refuse cooperation, and to make absolutely clear to the world that the Sussex brand and the British monarchy were two entirely different things that should never be confused for one another. The steel wall strategy. By this point, William had moved well beyond words and warnings. He had constructed something that the people around him were beginning to refer to privately as the steel wall, a total and deliberate shutdown of every possible connection between the Sussex household and the official structures of the British royal family. And it was comprehensive in a way that left absolutely no room for negotiation. No side doors, no back channels, no quiet exceptions made in the name of family feeling. The first and most visible element of the steel wall was access. Harry and Meghan were no longer welcome at royal residences. The grand estates and historic properties that had always been part of royal life were now firmly off limits to the Sussexes. And this was not an informal arrangement or a temporary cooling off. It was a fixed and deliberate policy that sent a message to everyone inside and outside the institution about exactly where Harry and Meghan stood in relation to the crown. Security was the next piece of the wall, and it was perhaps the most practically significant, because the question of who paid for and organized Harry's protection had been a running source of tension for years. Harry had argued repeatedly and publicly that he needed the kind of security that only the British state could provide. But William's position, shared firmly by the palace, was that a private citizen living abroad and building a commercial empire was not entitled to publicly funded royal protection, and that providing it would only blur the lines that the steel wall was specifically designed to make permanent and unmistakable. Informal contact had also been cut off in any meaningful sense. There were no shared engagements, no joint appearances, no quiet family moments that could be photographed and used to suggest that relations between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family were warmer than they actually were. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was one of the strongest supporters of this approach, and her reasons were deeply personal because at the center of her support for the steel wall was a determination to protect her 3 children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, from being drawn into a conflict that had already caused enormous damage. The Balmoral ban. Of all the decisions that William made in his effort to permanently separate the Sussex household from the structures and privileges of the British royal family, few carried as much symbolic weight as the one that excluded Harry and Meghan from Balmoral. The reason is that the Balmoral was not just a house. It was not just a holiday destination for wealthy royals. It was the spiritual heartland of the British monarchy, a place woven deeply into the fabric of royal history and royal identity. And being shut out of it was as powerful a statement as any document or public announcement could ever be. Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands had been a royal retreat for generations. It was the place where the royal family went every summer to step away from the pressures of public life, to walk the land, to be together as a family without cameras and without the constant scrutiny of the outside world. And it was the place where Queen Elizabeth had spent some of the most important and most private moments of her long reign, including her very final days, which made it sacred in the eyes of every member of the family who had gathered there to say goodbye to her. The rules around Balmoral had always been strict. No cameras, no media, no outside intrusion of any kind. And for William, that was precisely the point, because those rules meant that any presence at Balmoral carried no commercial value whatsoever. There were no photographs to sell, no footage to license, no public appearances to monetize, and no way to use the visit to reinforce the Sussex brand or suggest a closeness to the crown that William had been working so hard to publicly dismantle. By banning Harry and Meghan from Balmoral, William was doing something very specific and very calculated. He was cutting off one of the last remaining avenues through which the Sussexes could have generated what might be called royal proximity capital, the invisible but enormously powerful currency that comes from simply being seen in the right places with the right people. And in the world that Harry and Meghan had built for themselves, that kind of currency was worth a great deal. The ban also sent a message to the wider royal household and to the watching world that the separation between the working royal family and the Sussex household was not softening with time, it was hardening. It has become more defined and more permanent with every passing month that no amount of public statements about a desire for reconciliation or privately expressed wishes for peace would change the fundamental reality that William had decided on. The palace doors were closing, the Balmoral gates were shut, and the crown had drawn its line. The financial bombshell. Just as William's steel wall strategy was taking full effect and the distance between the Sussex household and the crown was becoming impossible to ignore, a bombshell landed that threw an entirely new and deeply damaging light on Harry and Meghan's activities. This came not from inside the palace, but from a book, a meticulously researched and deeply sourced biography written by the respected British journalist Tom Bower, whose reputation for rigorous investigation had made him one of the most feared writers of unauthorized biographies in the country. Bauer's book, titled Revenge, made a series of allegations that went far beyond the kind of personal and emotional territory that had dominated the Sussex story up to that point, because what Bauer was alleging was not simply that Harry and Meghan had been difficult or disloyal or careless with the feelings of the people around them. He was alleging something that struck at the heart of their public image as philanthropists and humanitarians, the suggestion that financial irregularities had occurred in connection with Senda Bele, the African charity that Harry had co-founded and that had been one of the most important and most personal expressions of his commitment to his late mother's legacy of compassionate public service. The allegations centered on claims that donors who had contributed money to Senda Bele had been redirected towards Sussex-aligned ventures, that funds intended for charitable work in Africa had found their way toward projects that served the Sussex brand, rather than the vulnerable communities the charity had been set up to help, and that the financial relationship between Harry's personal interests and his charitable activities was far less clean and far less transparent than the public had been led to believe. The fallout from these allegations was immediate and severe. Trust in the Senza Ball charity collapsed almost overnight, with donors and partner organizations demanding answers and transparency, and the operational work being carried out by the charity in Lesotho and Botswana, work that genuinely changed the lives of children and young people affected by poverty and disease, was thrown into uncertainty and crisis at a time when it could least afford the disruption. For William, the Bauer revelations did something that years of palace briefings and carefully managed public positioning had struggled to fully achieve. They gave the wider public a concrete and specific reason to look at the Sussex operation with genuine suspicion rather than simply divided opinion. They had reinforced with devastating precision the narrative that William had been building steadily and patiently, that what Harry and Meghan had constructed in the name of service and compassion was in reality something far more self-serving, and that the Crown had been absolutely right to draw the line when it did. Australia, backlash, and public revolt. William had always believed that if he was patient enough and disciplined enough, the public would eventually reach their own conclusions about Harry and Meghan, without the palace needing to say a single word. And nowhere was that belief more dramatically vindicated than in Australia. The tour that the Sussexes had clearly expected to be a triumphant and warmly received return to one of the most royally enthusiastic nations in the Commonwealth turned into something that looked, to many observers, far more like a public relations disaster. The tour, which Meghan branded under the title Her Best Life, was built around a series of events and appearances that were designed to position her as an empowering and inspirational figure for women, a global voice for well-being, self-improvement, and personal growth. And on paper, it had the kind of aspirational energy that her team clearly believed would translate well in a country known for its outdoor lifestyle and its embrace of wellness culture. But the reality on the ground was very different from what had been planned. The ticket prices shocked people, with some seats priced at $3,000, a figure that generated immediate and widespread outrage from ordinary Australians, who pointed out that the woman charging those prices had spent years presenting herself as someone who understood the struggles of everyday people and who cared deeply about issues of inequality and access. And the contrast between that carefully constructed image and the reality of a $3,000 ticket to sit in a room and listen to her talk was one that many people found impossible to ignore or excuse. A petition calling for the removal of taxpayer-funded security for the Sussexes during their time in Australia gathered 35,000 signatures in a matter of days, a number that spoke volumes about the shift in public sentiment, because security at that level cost significant amounts of public money. A growing number of Australians were asking a very reasonable question. Why should ordinary taxpayers fund the protection of two people who had walked away from royal duties, built a multi-million-dollar commercial empire, and were now charging $3,000 a ticket for a wellness event? William watched all of this unfold from London with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had always known this moment would come. Because he had never needed to attack Harry and Meghan publicly or aggressively, he had simply needed to hold the line, maintain the steel wall, and allow the Sussexes the space and the freedom to show the world exactly who they were. Eventually, in Australia, with the ticket prices and the petition and the growing chorus of public frustration, they had done precisely that, more effectively than anything William could ever have arranged himself. The institutional divorce. When historians look back at this period in the story of the British monarchy, they will point to one moment above all others as the moment when the future became clear. And that moment was not a dramatic public announcement or a bitter televised interview. It was quieter than that. It was the moment when the people inside Buckingham Palace simply stopped leaving the door open. The steel wall had begun as a strategy, a calculated and deliberate response to a specific problem. But over time, it had become something else entirely. It had become the permanent and official posture of the British royal family toward the Sussexes. And there was no longer any serious expectation on either side that things would ever go back to the way they had been before. William had emerged from this entire episode as something the public had not fully seen before. A future king who was not afraid to make hard decisions, who understood that protecting the institution sometimes meant making choices that were painful on a personal level, and who had the discipline and the patience to see a long and difficult strategy through to its conclusion without flinching. The monarchy itself had changed too. It was leaner, it was more focused, and it was built around a very simple idea that William had held onto from the very beginning, that the crown existed to serve the public and not the other way around, and that anyone who forgot that truth had no place inside its walls. For Harry and Meghan, the message could not have been clearer. The palace was closed, the titles were under review, the gates of Balmoral would not open for them, and the crown had made its peace with the future, a future that was William's, disciplined, determined, and moving forward without looking back. What part of this story touched you most? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below, like this video, and subscribe for more incredible stories just like this one.